I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these.
We now will hear from Ranking Member of the Course Subcommittee, Senator Kennedy of Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans may be poorer under the Biden administration, but they are not stupid. They know what's going on here. I remember the Democratic leader's words of March 4th, 2020, on the steps of the United States Supreme Court, like they were yesterday. I want to tell you, Gorsuch, he said, not Justice Gorsuch, Gorsuch. I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions. Wow. Just wow. I think Matthew 12:36 is correct. For by thy words you shall be justified, and by thy words you shall be condemned. Now, the sad truth is that some, not all, some of my Democratic colleagues have been on a crusade to undermine the United States Supreme Court's legitimacy and the credibility of the federal judiciary for years. Today's the next chapter in their federal power, and they use confusion that's for God's sakes. The Washington Post verdict afterward. In other words, they gave him a fair and impartial firing squad. Then we saw the high-tech lynching of Justice Clarence Thomas. Then, for the first time in history, they weaponized the filibuster to kill Mr. Miguel Estrada's nomination, and they also demonized Justice Janice Rogers Brown, a very fine person. When the United States Senate confirmed 3 new Supreme Court justices, which the Loon wing of the Democratic Party loathed, the campaign of threats ratcheted up. You remember the shouts. Let's pack the court, they said. Let's pack the court. And the political threats of some of the highest officials in our government fueled physical threats against the justices, and we know that. You have released the whirlwind, the Democratic leader said. Incensed protesters took to the streets, not outside Congress, not outside the court, but outside the homes of Justice Roberts, Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Thomas, and Justice Barrett. Federal law prohibits this intimidation, but the Biden Justice Department allowed it. You will pay the price, the Democratic leader said. In that spirit, angry protesters publicized the location of the school that Justice Barrett's children attend. You won't know what hit you, the Democratic leader said. A man with a gun, ammunition, knife, pepper spray, and zip ties went to a justice's home to assassinate him. Actually, his stated goal was to murder 3 justices. Not so suddenly, the ends justified the means for activists. Even inside the court itself, the Dobbs decision was not leaked by a left-wing blogger. Why? That's worth asking. You don't need to be Einstein's cousin to figure it out. They aren't getting their way. They aren't getting their way, so they want to change the rules. But the Constitution isn't a game, folks. And now some Democrats want Congress to override the Supreme Court of the United States and apply rules to its justices. The constitutional separation of powers means that no branch of the federal government can dictate how another should govern itself. That's black letter law. Now, why? This is to protect the people from abuse. The framers insulated the federal judiciary from political control to ensure that the justices would decide cases impartially, without fear of the kind of retaliation that fills the pages of some, not all, but some left of Lenin Democrats' playbook. Do my colleagues want the United States Supreme Court to tell Congress how to police itself? Even if Congress wrote a code of ethics for the Supreme Court, the court could rightly rule that code is unconstitutional. None of the laws we make here trump the United States Constitution. What's more, some Democrats want to use the lower courts as a cudgel against the highest court in the land by giving circuit judges the power to rule on whether justices should recuse themselves. Consider the conflicts of interest and the confusion that that would breed. Unless you peaked in high school, you must know they will be breathtaking. Now, the absence of an ethics code written by Congress in statute doesn't mean that justices lack guidance or accountability. Justices and judges routinely consult the existing code of conduct, and federal law already requires recusal in certain circumstances like bias or financial interest. We all know that. The justices are also subject to strict financial disclosure rules, just like my colleagues here. Not only is this Democratic proposal unconstitutional, it is unnecessary. The attacks on conservative justices are targeted. They're exaggerated. The alarmism is affected. The danger isn't that rogue justices are operating without ethics. It's that Democrats aren't winning every fight and they find that reality intolerable. I've been disappointed by Supreme Court opinions too. But my Democratic colleagues should fill out a hurt feelings report and move on for the sake of the Constitution. Look, the agenda-driven story here is that Justice Thomas has a rich friend who had no business before the United States Supreme Court. For context, let's recall that history is littered with examples of public officials failing to disclose their every transaction. We can acknowledge it's required by law. It is. We can acknowledge it's the right thing to do. It is. But we can do that without maligning each justice's motives and the entire institution's credibility, for God's sakes. You know who else amended their disclosures because of inadvertent admissions? Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Stephen Breyer. Two good people. Justice Jackson made multiple amendments 3 days after President Biden nominated her. Not one senator brought that up during her confirmation hearings. Not one of my colleagues here walked into her hearings with the buckets of mud that they've thrown against Justice Thomas. Not one. Nor should we have. In the last month, some, not all, but some Democrats and their media allies have hyped up attempted hit pieces on every Republican-appointed Supreme Court justice except for one. They tried going after Justice Kavanaugh for buying baseball tickets, Justice Alito for having dinner with people who gossip, the wife of Chief Justice Roberts for hiring good lawyers, Justice Gorsuch for selling land in an LLC, which he properly disclosed to a major donor to the Democratic Party, for God's sakes, who he's never even met, and Justice Thomas for having a rich friend. Justice Barrett, if you're listening, I hope you don't have library books overdue. If recent history is any indicator, you're next. Today's hearing is an excuse to sling more mud at an institution that some, not all, some Democrats don't like because they can't control it 100% of the time. And that's a fact, and everybody in this hearing room knows that. Until they get the outcome they want in every case, I fear they are going to continue to slander it in an effort to take control of it. And I pray to God I am wrong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy.
It ends with Senator John Kennedy saying, "And I pray to God I am wrong." Those were the last words. That is where this chapter closes. That is the final note ringing in the chamber. Not as joke, not as punchline, but as warning. This is where the air freezes. Because whether you agree with him or not, whether you believe his accusations or not, whether you believe his history chain and his read of democratic conduct or not, that final sentence was not said like a meme. It was said like a man staring at something he genuinely believes is existential rot. This is not noise. This is not internet culture war packaging. This is a United States senator, in a formal recorded congressional hearing, accusing senators and the leadership of another party of undermining the legitimacy of the Supreme Court itself, and then ending by praying to God he is wrong about the consequences. This is one of those moments where the stakes become visible again. Congress is not merely drafting statutes here. Congress is defining the authority boundaries of the third branch of government, the branch that cannot defend itself in politics, that cannot lobby, that cannot campaign, that cannot retaliate, that cannot correct reputational harm in real time. The judiciary only speaks through written adjudication, through opinion, through reason. It doesn't speak back in soundbite. And Kennedy's closing statement forces us to confront a truth that is older than cable news, older than the filibuster, older than partisan internet tribalism. When you delegitimize the court, when you delegitimize the neutral referee, when you delegitimize the institution that cannot fight back, you risk the collapse of the last shared settlement mechanism a plural democracy has. He threads history like indictment, from Miguel Estrada's nomination blocked, to Justice Clarence Thomas's bruising smear wars, to now a moment where a sitting senator quotes the Democratic leader on the steps of the Supreme Court saying, "You won't know what hit you." Kennedy frames those words as spiritual violence, citing Matthew 12:36, calling the biblical principle onto the Senate record, "By thy words you shall be justified, and by thy words you shall be condemned." This is what hearings look like when the constitutional cultural floor is shaking. What happens when law becomes a battlefield of political outcomes instead of a sanctuary of consistent rules? What happens when ethics enforcement is no longer neutral guardrail, but political weapon? What happens when public trust collapses so fully that even transparency is interpreted only through team jerseys? Kennedy's argument is this: the Democratic Party is not attacking the court because of ethics. They are attacking because they are losing. To him, this is not reform. This is retaliation. That is why he lists the personal lives invoked. That is why he lists the private schools published. That is why he lists the assassination attempt. This is not an academic dispute to him. This is a violence risk vector emerging from political rhetoric. Now, again, this is his framing. But this hearing matters because this is not just a Fox clip or a MSNBC chyron. This is a formal hearing where accusations of systemic delegitimization were spoken into the congressional record itself, with committee stenographer, with C-SPAN cameras, with the weight of institutional precedent behind every syllable. Government is not just policy execution. Government is narrative construction. And when the Senate begins labeling the Supreme Court as being under coordinated political attack, that is no small footnote. That is the sign of a constitutional order in stress test. This moment also reveals the deeper moral divide about power in this era. There are people who believe the Supreme Court is the last firewall protecting constitutional restraint in the age of populism. And there are people who believe the Supreme Court is the last unchecked elite power blocking democratic correction. To Kennedy, the court is the final break against an ideological machine. To others, the court is the machine. This is why this hearing is uncomfortable, because it shows us the philosophical war is not about one case, not about one ethics rule, not about one billionaire. It is about who gets to define legitimacy itself. The line that the Constitution is not a game is not just rhetoric. It is a warning that if this continues on this trajectory, where legitimacy becomes a partisan trophy, then we no longer adjudicate differences through institutions. We adjudicate differences through force. And the force does not have to be kinetic to be destructive. Force can be reputational. Force can be intimidation. Force can be narrative warfare. Force can be social media mob. Force can be perpetual scandal economy as instrument. When Kennedy says he hopes to God he is wrong, that part is not performative. That is the moral dread of a nation where the final referee is dragged into the arena and forced to fight with the gladiators. And so this ends where these hearings always ultimately demand from us: moral responsibility, constitutional reverence, civic adulthood, the understanding that if the Supreme Court becomes just another partisan branch, then the United States loses the last institution that can anchor rule of law in the storm. This is why this hearing matters, because this moment is not about one hearing. This is about the trajectory of the Republic. If you believe this fight matters, if you believe sunlight matters, if you believe accountability matters, then stay here. Stay engaged. Subscribe to Congress Signal.